The large Alberta oil sands companies today announced a new initiative to get the industry to net zero by 2050. It includes in a partnership with the Alberta government and the federal government, and all sorts of financial incentives like tax credits. And so I'm going to talk to Eric Denhoff, who is a former Alberta Deputy Minister for Climate Change and the Environment, see what he thinks government's role should be in this and what government should pay for. So welcome to the interview, Eric.
Thanks very much, Markham.
Look, what's your take on the announcement that was made this morning?
Well, listen, I think it's great that the large companies are getting together, the oil sands partners, to reduce their emissions quite dramatically in the time frame they've described. My concern is the cost of the taxpayer of doing it. And, my thought is, you lend your son or daughter your car to go out for Friday night, they come back with it all smashed up. And you say, well, part of responsibility is having to pay for your consequences. So you got to fix that car. And they say, well, I spent all my allowance and I spent all the money grandma and grandpa gave me for birthdays. I don't have any. Will you give me the money to fix the car? And so my concern here is great to be reducing the emissions, but if the taxpayers have to pay a big chunk of it, I just don't see the rationale. At $30 to $35 break even, these folks are making really good money right now. They're, $50 WTI. They have made really good money the last little while, and they used a lot of it for dividends, shareholder buybacks, and things like that. So let's look at what they've been getting, in terms of subsidies. We've given Shell almost $1 billion for the first CCS project, which I think is now breaking even or making a little money on operational but not capital costs. We've given them $1.5 billion for cleanup of orphan wells. We've given them billions in grants through federal and provincial governments for technology, recycled money through the provincial clean tech agency. Why do we have to keep paying for them to do what they should be doing in the first place, which is not polluting?
Well, let me frame it for you this way, which will reinforce your point that you're making, Eric. So Suncor last week announced its own net zero by 2050 plan, and there was an investor presentation released on last Wednesday. And in it, the company said, look, we think by 2025, we're going to generate another $2 billion of free cash flow, basically, cash that'll be in the company's bank. And they said, we're going to give 100% of the first billion back to shareholders in dividends and share buybacks. We'll give 50% of the second billion back to shareholders. Mm-hmm. And then we'll have another $500 million and we'll decide what we want to do with that. And so my question was looking at that and go, well, how can you go to the taxpayers of Canada and Alberta and with your hand out? I mean, surely the shareholders who would benefit from the increase in the value of the company if you got your emissions down and your revenue up, surely there's enough cash there to pay it out of the kitty. And so I don't know what that seems to back up your argument.
I mean, my problem is you become non-equity partners when government's putting in a big chunk. So, yes, exactly what they're doing is saying, in order to attract capital, we feel we have to dividend out to them these very large amounts of free cash flow, and we'll replace that with government money. Well, if government's really going to be your investor, government should have a piece of equity then. You're giving equity away to New York and Chicago and London and Singapore investors or whomever, and then you're using taxpayers' money to replace that lost free cash flow. So, it's much like Air Canada in a way. We bailed out Air Canada a couple of times since it was privatized. Now we go give them a whack more money in return for very little return. And so I'm not sure, there's a dramatic need for the subsidy. We already subsidize CCS, so we proved up the technology. We know they can do it. One thing people forget is we're only pricing about 5 or 10% of the emissions that the oil sand companies are putting out. They're not paying a pollution price on 80 or 90% of their pollution. So what they're saying to us is we can't afford to produce oil and deliver it to our customers, including the cost of the pollution, unless you government basically subsidize not only not pricing about 90 or so percent of that pollution in the first place, but you also subsidize a big chunk of the remaining 10%. So you're basically giving them an entirely free ride. And strikes me as pretty silly. So.
Well, let me now argue the other side of this
Sure.
argument, and I have no doubt that you, when you were a deputy minister, you participated in many discussions like this, which is that governments have an interest in reducing externalities. They want to get to net zero in a particular time frame. That's good public policy. There are other benefits to it, and therefore, and not only that, if the industry remains profitable over time, they benefit from additional tax dollars and other revenues. Mm-hmm. And that's why government should come to the table and put some money in, not all money, but some money. So how have my hypothetical deputy minister's argument, how does that play?
I mean, I think it's reasonable, although I know lots of progressives would disagree with me, but I think it's reasonable for government to say, look, there's a lot of jobs here, there's a lot of wealth created. We have an interest as a society in keeping these jobs going for whatever the transition period is. It's the amount of the subsidy. So in terms of externalities, you want to convince me as a citizen to get rid of my fossil fuel car and go to an electric car. So you'll give me a subsidy of about, I don't know, 5 or 10% of the cost of that new vehicle if I choose to purchase an electronic vehicle for a relatively short period of time until it becomes mainstream. So you're not giving me $40,000 of the $60,000 electric car or $30,000 of the $40,000 electric car. You're giving me $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000. With the oil sand companies, my worry is we're really giving them such a free ride that it becomes a moral hazard, because we're saying you don't have to pay for your cleanup costs after the fact, because we've taken in $1 billion versus an estimated $2 or $250 billion of cleanup costs. You don't have to pay anywhere remotely the costs of your pollution in real time as you're doing it, and we're gonna provide these massive subsidies. So if it was like hydrogen, like the Alberta government induced a $1.5 billion announcement today on the new hydrogen plant with Air Products, and they're putting in $15 million. So you kind of look at that and you go, okay, that doesn't seem like a very significant inducement. Plus, what you're doing is you're taking a chunk of the oil that would otherwise be burned in fossil fuel vehicles, and you're putting it into a hydrogen plant and into plastics and all these sorts of things with these inducements. I have more time for those than simply taking money to subsidize a current polluting operation who should be able to, on their own merits, pay the cost of reducing pollution for the most part.
Is it fair to say, Eric, then, if I could summarize your argument, that you're not in favor of an excessive subsidy for this initiative?
Yeah.
You do think that it's worthy of some support, as long as that is a reasonable amount and not duly onerous on the taxpayer, particularly since these companies will be incredibly profitable over conceivably the next 5 years and maybe even 10 and longer.
Exactly. And I think we should get something back for it. So if you looked at the original Shell CCS project, the government's put in about 800 million almost, and Shell put in 300 or 400 million. So, the government's put in 3/4 of the money basically, and get virtually or no return. So on these new projects for the oil sands, I don't want to see government putting in 50 or 60 or 70% of the money, either through tax credits or other forms of subsidies. If we're putting in 3 or 4 or 5%, and ideally on a repayable loan basis, maybe there's an interest rate subsidy, maybe there's an extended time frame for them to repay it, and that sort of thing, fine. But I also think if we're putting in subsidies, on the one hand, we get up in the morning, we give them $1.5 billion to clean up orphaned oil wells that the companies have a legal responsibility to clean up themselves, and then in the afternoon we give them subsidies, for their operations. And I'm going, well, wait a minute, like if we're going to give them tax incentives and subsidies for the oil sands, why is there some quid pro quo on them bumping up their cleanup contributions, for example, and a very modest contribution on the operating side? Anyway.
Well, that strikes me as a reasonable argument. So, Eric, thank you very much. Always appreciate your insights.
Super. Thanks very much, Mark. Take care.